Welcome, everybody, to the STORK Summit. I'm Vanessa Yingling. I'm serving as chair of the executive committee for, 2 years, and STORK has been around for a little over 3 years. And so I just wanted, for anybody that didn't know our mission, to put it up. And so STORK is a nonprofit service organization, and our goal is to improve the quality of research in all our respective fields. So I just wanted to go by the numbers. We have about 150 members. We now have actually more than 2,024 Twitter followers. We have 2 journals, a preprint server. We had 1 registered report project that is in one of the journals. We have an open access textbook. We had a SumR tutorial last summer, and now we have our first summit. So just going through that, I was pretty impressed with what we've accomplished in a short period of time. And so I just wanted to thank some people, and basically I want to thank John Mills, who will join us tomorrow, who's basically the visionary of STORK. All the authors on the first paper that, and I'll link it into the chat a little later, that kind of was the impetus to kind of move STORK forward. The executive committee, current and past, you guys have done a great job. Outreach committee, our publications committee, our treasurer, who made us a nonprofit and who's been dealing with all the membership. And I do want to thank for the current summit funding from SIPS, the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. And then to introduce us off, a special thanks to Emer Dolan, who this could not be possible without her. She is the momentum, my biomechanics term, of this entire summit. So Emer, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, but way too generous, and also too much responsibility. If something goes wrong, we'll take group. But no, it's been a great experience kind of being involved in this. So guys, we're going to get going with a talk from James in approximately 5 minutes. He's scheduled to start at 10 past 7. 10 past 7, well, I said 7 Pacific time, depending on where you are. I think we're very, very spread out right now all over the world. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Before we get started, I just wanted to share just a couple of small practicalities. I see James raising his hand there. Hey, James. But yeah, I'm just going to share a couple of just small practicalities as to how we envisage this running over the next 2 days. I won't talk for long, I promise. Really probably didn't need a slide to have this. Why is it that after how long has the pandemic did it go on for? It's a blink. I still can't figure out share screens and where the buttons are. But anyway, just very small things that I wanted to quickly run through before we get started, just to keep things running smoothly, is that first and foremost, everything will be on this Zoom link. So you just need the one link, so it's handy to keep it somewhere close. I would suggest once you're in, just stay in. If you need to head off, say for another meeting or for grab a coffee or do something else, just turn off your camera and stay online. It'll be the easiest job rather than coming in and out. Throughout the session, obviously, when we initially planned this, we visualized it as a live event. However, with everything happening, it was our very first event. We are very geographically spread out. It'll be interesting actually to do a poll on just how many time zones we're covering. And of course, with COVID, we decided that the smart option would be to just go for the online event. However, our vision was always for this to act as an opportunity to get people together, to try to brainstorm, to talk. So I really hope that we can make the most of this, even though it's virtual, that we can have plenty of interaction, discussion. So first and foremost, let's use the chats as much as we can. We've also, I hope you can all see there on the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see breakout rooms. And there's 3 different rooms. So one is speaker room, and one of us, this is obviously for the speakers. If you want to pop in before your talk to check your slides, check your audio, make sure everything's running fine, that is absolutely fine. There would be somebody from STORK there at all times to give you a hand. We've got the general chat room. So the idea is that on the breaks, obviously, if you need to head off and do whatever you need to do for a few minutes, feel free. But if you're around, head on into that general chat room, and hopefully we can have some conversations about the talks after they happen. We have tried to schedule multiple just short breaks throughout, like kind of 5 or 10 minutes in between every couple of sessions, because obviously being staring at a screen can be tricky. And what we also have there is a breakout room called specific projects. So hopefully there might be an opportunity today and tomorrow for people to get together to potentially brainstorm projects. If you've got a problem and you can't figure out how to fix it, maybe somebody here will be able to help you out. I've already seen in our abstracts, we had 2 that just align perfectly. So I'm really hoping Jenny and Gabriel might have a chance to talk today or at some stage about that. But let's see what kind of things we can make. So if you want to have a specific chat with somebody, feel free to head into that specific project room where you can have a more private chat. And if anybody wants us to set up, if that's in use, and if you want us to set up another room so that you can head in and have a chat with somebody, just let us know. Throughout the event, look, we're a fairly small, open, friendly group. Stick it in the chat if you have any issues. There's a email address there, STORK Summit at storkkinesiology.org. One of us will be keeping an eye on that right throughout the event. So any issues whatsoever, just get in touch. But also feel free, either direct chat or in the main chat. Let's just keep communicating throughout. Something that I will send to everyone who registered shortly, and I'll share a few times in the chat, got a very brief Google form questionnaire just with feedback on what's your thoughts, why are you here, if anything jumped out from the sessions. It would be really great if everyone can fill that out at some point throughout the event. If you want to fill it out more than once, that's absolutely fine, because one of the questions is there anything from the events or talks you've heard so far that has stood out to you, you think you'd like to implement in practice? So if a subsequent talk is particularly interesting, feel very free to do that more than once. And at the end of the event, we plan to have like a more general discussion and a panel discussion, kind of look into the future, and we'll use some of the responses there to inform and guide that discussion. And I think that's pretty much it. Just to reiterate what Vanessa said, thank you very much to SIPS, who we really wanted this to be available to everyone, open to everyone. And of course, STORK is always, money will never be a barrier to participation. However, at the same time, the sites and platforms and the events do have running costs. So it was really great to be able to get that support from SIPS, which allowed us to open up training registration. So just would like to say thank you for that. And without any further ado, I think that we can get going. With a slightly unusual format today, but I think actually it's going to work out really well. Our first speaker is James Heathers, who is the Chief Scientific Officer for the company CypherSkin, which are a biomedical company that make wearable technologies. I think most of us will know James as being a very strong advocate for scientific reform in general, for his work in meta-science, and partly for being one half of the fantastic Everything Hurts duo. So I think most people are going to be familiar with James. I'm very excited for the talk. Due to a last minute scheduling conflict, we're taking a slightly alternative way of doing this. James is here. He's in the chat. He is available. However, it wasn't practical for him he's in transit and it wasn't practical to live deliver. So he very, very kindly recorded his sessions last night, which I think will work out great because we now have 2 James. We have the James of last night who will be talking to us, and we have the James of today who is in the chat ready to discuss and take any questions that you have. So let's take advantage of that. No need to save your questions till the end. Pop them in the chat as and when you have them. And yeah, I think, have I forgotten anything, Vanessa, Jennifer, Zach? We all good? Let's get going. James, I'm aware you probably can't talk, but just on behalf of STORK, thanks a million. Massively appreciated. Really excited for this talk. Oh, and guys, let me know if the audio is okay, because earlier when I tested it was quite low. So that's on my computer. Make sure, just let me know if you can see and hear everything okay. So
Hello, Stoky people. It's James Heathers here. I am recording this in the middle of the night before.
Apologies, guys. Before we get going, I'm just going to check. Vision, sound, all good? James, I hope you're enjoying seeing your own face from last night. And now I'll shut up and let's get going.
Hello, Stoky people. It's James Heathers here. I am recording this in the middle of the night before, due to what can only be described as a massive scheduling conflict of my own making. However, there is a silver lining to this. I will be available during this talk to answer QA in real time while watching myself talk, which should be an amusing experience for everyone. It means we get to use the time twice. I'm just not going to be able to talk at that time, but I can answer questions in text. Hello, Present James. This is the result of your inability to plan your life. So, without further ado, as the previous recorded version of this talk was 94 minutes, as I tried to get literally everything that is wrong with science in 50 mere human minutes, let us proceed with the figurative version that's a little bit more STORK appropriate. So, who am I? Straightforward. Ph.D. 2017, variety of postdocs after that, research scientist job. Left academia in July of 2020 to become the chief scientific officer of a company that makes medical wearables. I also did a ton of meta-science research for nearly a decade because I'm still doing it. I'll tell you about that in a second. Quick word on cypherskin.com. We employ biomechanists and data scientists. Long story short, if you want to find out what's up with that, this is the update email address that I have. We're going to expand in the reasonably near future. So if you want to find out what's up with that, that's the easiest way to find out. You write to that email address, say keep me updated, and I will. Okay, PSA over. Let's talk about matter science. This is why I'm here. I've done a ton of work over a period of years with Dr. Nick Brown, who you can see in the top photo as a serial killer from the 70s, and then a significantly older serial killer from the present day. The next splash graphic is me when I had longer hair and didn't own a comb. That's the splash graphic from my podcast, Everything Hurts. I know there's at least a couple of people who are regular listeners that are here. Hi, also, sorry. I have some silly Twitter accounts that are designed to hector and annoy journalists into reporting biomedical science properly, which is a good thing, and everyone is amused by, and also an account that is attempting to hector the academic world into paying me to do peer review, which is regarded a lot less fondly, especially by publishers who keep refusing to pay me. So it's reasonable to say I've been involved in some version of scientific reform for quite some time in a variety of different respects. It's been a very interesting ride. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Ellen Rachel Bry, who is a artificially generated, bright young woman of completely indeterminate background. And I wanted someone entirely neutral to think about the headspace that would result when I say what I'm about to say. So let's say she's a recent graduate student and she's discovering everything that you no doubt talk about, and many of the things that I have researched and commented on for years. And she's coming at this from scratch. So let's think about the headspace of Ellen as we go through all of the following. Now, it was really difficult to confine myself to 7 things here. I promise you, for any one of these individual pieces, I have done 45 minutes on just peer review in the past. I have done well over an hour on fraud and falsification, and I have tried real hard to stuff this sausage into exactly the time frame required. So you're going to have to forgive me if I jump around a little. There will be jumping. Be prepared for some abrupt non sequiturs. Okay? Right. Let's get into the guts of it. I want to talk about peer review first for one really simple reason. And it's the fact that we put it on a pedestal as a process to improve science. And we treat it as if it is a sacrosanct procedure that has always been in place, that makes perfect sense, and it's something that we don't need to consider. I would offer a different perspective on that. I think as an institution, it's probably necessary in some degree, but at the very least, it's severely overrated when it comes to improving the quality of research, which is the focus that I'm going to take on it, as you're about to see. The really nice part about peer review is that it's very eminently possible to investigate empirically. And the nice thing about empirical investigation is that it will tell you exactly what you want to know if you ask it the right questions, which is awfully handy. So, how do we do it? How do we investigate peer review? Oh, yeah. I should probably say first, a lot of people who are reasonably well informed about this, like Richard Smith, the incredibly famous medical editor, have a reasonably similar opinion to me. I probably wouldn't go quite this far, though, although he's certainly edited a lot more papers than I ever will. Slow, expensive, largely a lottery, poor at detecting error, ineffective at diagnosing fraud, biased, and prone to abuse. That is a hell of a line, sir. So, let's talk about two things: improving methodology and improving accuracy. Now, we'll get to accuracy in a minute, but generally when I talk to people about this, they posit the fact that peer review makes methodology better, usually by asking people to improve it in papers which are peer-reviewed, and by rejecting work that does not ostensibly follow sufficient methodological rigor to be published in the first place. Now, that's very easy to investigate as an empirical question. You simply write a canned paper, and then you send it to a variety of people who normally do peer review under different conditions and say, one more for the road. Let's have another go. Peer review this paper for me. You're going to be in my study. Well, when you do that, and people have done that for quite a long time, these papers were released when I was in high school, and I'm old. 2 out of 3 reviewers cannot identify conclusions unsupported by data. If you put in a series of strong weaknesses, you get 2 out of 8. Overall, less than 3 out of 9 major errors identified. That is not a good hit rate. It's interesting to think about how that would change the binary outcome of what you might think of a paper. But also bear in mind there's a significant percentage, if we're only talking about 2 out of 8 strong weaknesses, for people who don't identify any of them at all. But presumably if you identified at least one, it will result in action for the paper, which obviously is better than nothing. But you can see with a number that low, a lot of the time, bad work is slipping through the net. So the methodological improvements of it are a little bit questionable. And this is by no means the full extent of the research on just how stochastic a process it can be. But let's also quickly talk about whether or not it improves the accuracy of papers. Now, people often don't think of peer review as a method of improving accuracy, and it really isn't. Less than half of editors check for plagiarism, and this paper by Cole, this is marvelous because they put numerical discrepancies in the papers and then told people to go look for them, and the hit rate was pathetic. And it is this exact quote, it is this exact environment that is how I got interested in error detection in the first place, because obviously these things are sitting out there waiting to be found and entirely unnoticed, entirely overlooked by people who are reading with a non-critical mindset. So that's not good, especially when we put review on a pedestal as the definitive categorical barrier between something that is a preprint, a non-reviewed manuscript, which are naughty and bad, versus something that is appropriately peer-reviewed by the appropriate people. That's not a categorical barrier. It's a very, very porous one. And nothing has brought that home to me anywhere near as hard as having to live through the last 2.5 years of the goddamn plague. The amount of terrible work that has been done, that has gone on to influence policy and turn up on the news, be endlessly repeated on the internet, is too damn high. It's very, very difficult to argue that preprints are an enormous problem when the cachet of bad peer-reviewed work is so much higher and has gone on to do such a tremendous amount of damage to public health. Now, obviously, there's been some tremendous successes over the last few years as well, but I would argue that the ratio is nowhere near where it should be. Anyway, I want to hit a few other points while I'm here quickly. Regardless of whether or not we're improving methodology or accuracy, we need to keep in mind the fact that also peer review is not something that happens once, it's something that happens multiple times. So if you write a terrible paper and you submit it to a journal and it's rejected because it isn't very good, then generally the authors, who obviously have their publication counts in mind and other such silliness that in a sane world we would pay very little attention to, will simply send it to a different journal. Good peer review incentivizes more peer review until bad peer review is achieved. I was wearing the clever pants when I came up with that one. That is a good saying. It's also true. It's also very hard to investigate because you need the information about where the paper is submitted, sometimes multiple times before it ends up at its eventual happy home, where reviewers are happy to let it in, presumably in one of those categories from the previous slide where 0 major errors were identified. So this creates an environment that has inherently a tremendous amount of organization and overwork. And very little of this is paid. Some editorial work is, obviously, but a lot of it is not. It just ends up being essentially an extra burden, and reviews are reproduced over and over again until the porous barrier is breached. I took a straw poll a while back from people I know who are editors. I got all sorts of numbers, but that was the smallest value and the highest value that I got. They're estimates, of course, but a tremendous amount of work often goes into the process of getting you just 2 people to peer review your papers badly. And for some reason, a tremendous amount of peer review is done at a very sort of Pareto principle kind of level, where, you know, 1/5 of the people do 4/5 of the work, or give or take. And it's usually because I imagine that either they're strongly committed to it as an idea, or they think it's going to confer some benefit. I know a lot of people who are tenure track have tried to demonstrate what good community members they are by doing as much peer review as possible while they're being collectively evaluated. Again, not amazingly healthy. I also want to knock it off its pedestal for a bit. Bear in mind that peer review in the history of science is a reasonably recent idea. It was only really the de facto standard within the publishing lifetime of many people who were still publishing, and hinges largely around the availability of information than it does around some idea that it was the best possible way of being able to maintain an academic standard. Journals were happy for many, many years, some of them all the way up into the 2000s, of letting the editors of journals make decisions. Obviously, it needs to be a journal of a certain size, quite small, but historically, an awful lot of journals were. Suffice to say that the modern mega conglomerate is, within the publishing space, is also a relatively recent idea. We won't go into how it isn't a particularly good one right now. So, a final note about this is not a new point. Very little of what I'm about to say is a new point. A lot of it has been simply reiterated over time. The only thing that really changes is the tools we have available to deal with it. and the speed with which we can make mistakes, which digital life allows us. So just have a guess in your mind. I'll give you 5 seconds. Try and figure out when this was written down. A 2-week barrier to be able to, 2 people, 2 weeks. The time demands on the reviewer tend to become intolerable. When was that written? 1974. Again, not a new point. These problems go into a long history of efforts to reform. Now, it may leave you feeling a little bit hopeless. If this gentleman was complaining about it in 1974, why are we here complaining about it again? But we'll get to that at the end, I promise. So I'm sure this one directly concerns people in exercise science and kinesiology. Data availability. You work in an area where it's very hard to get data. It's time consuming, it's expensive. You have to administer an awful lot of exercise sometimes to an awful lot of people, or you need to do a tremendous amount of computation and collect some very large data files. It would be nice if there were open resources available to be able to do this work. But data availability ranges from grimly acceptable to dreadful. Now, this very much changes by academic field. Some areas are quite good. Ecology is quite good, for instance. Some areas of economics are okay. But I think forestry is the worst one, interestingly enough. And psychology, if there's any social scientists in the room, hi. And the sort of global pantheon of the scientific endeavor, you really suck at data sharing and you shouldn't. But here's a bright point. 80% of authors don't even reply to data sharing requests after indicating availability. So this is called a DOR in the sort of scientometric business, data on request. Data is available to reasonable request, which is a shame until you're someone like me and the request is deemed unreasonable. That doesn't work out a lot of the time. But this paper was just published. A tremendous amount of work went into this. It was done in an entire group of journals, some hundreds, I believe. And they found more than 3,000 papers, and about 1,800 of them had statements as the data was available on request. The authors did not reply to 81% of those individual requests. Now, I think that has changed a lot over different studies, but I think this is actually, even though it's I only saw it a few days ago, I think this is probably the most interesting figure of all of them. For the simple reason that this is 3 obviously very diligent researchers from, I believe it's Croatia. Oh, good Lord, it could be Serbia. My apologies to people from both nations. Suffice to say, they aren't famous academics from English-speaking countries who have conducted this sort of research previously. When someone very fancy turns up and asks if they can see your data, maybe the incentive is different than if it's 3 people that you don't know with names that may seem unfamiliar to you. That sort of thing can matter to people. Maybe the request was simply dismissed on that basis. It can be very difficult to say. Suffice to say, 1,461 individual researchers ignoring the email is a dreadful result. Now let's talk about irreproducibility, something fun. Now, let's not get confused here. Reproducibility can be split into a variety of different versions. We have methodological and computational and what I call scientific reproducibility. Computational is basically if we've got the old data, does the code run, basically? And I would call scientific reproducibility the ability to run it over again from scratch, the play it again Sam version of the same thing. So new data, old result. Reproducibility, sometimes in a biological sense, which I think some of these studies here focus on with the incredibly high reproducibility failures. That is more in the sense of, is all of the information required to run this experiment present in the document in the first place? But no matter how you cut it or which version of this you use, it isn't very good. You shouldn't be able to you shouldn't be able to be confused by more than half of any of those documents. And this is just in preclinical research. The estimated fiscal loss of this from this paper is quite a famous number. It's quite famous because it's big. It's $28 billion. Now, obviously, that comes with a tremendous confidence interval, as something like this has to. But it's still a hell of a lot of money one way or another. And it is very difficult to reconcile with that as the idea of science as a public good. How are we to understand the fact that we are generating resources for everyone with money generally that is derived from everyone? And then this is what the actual outcomes are. There's obviously a tremendous delta in the sort of trustworthiness here that could be improved. But I mean, let's get away from preclinical research and just talk about the old school open science collaboration version. Ignore the plot on the left because that's p-values, and p-values are for clowns. Just look at the values on the right-hand side, the effect sizes. We're going from about a 0.35 to about a 0.13, I think it was, something like that. It went down approximately by a factor of 3. A tremendous deflation in the effect size. I think the frontline result of this was 34% of the individual results ended up achieving significance, whatever the hell that's worth. But suffice to say, I look at this diagram on the right-hand side, figure B, at the astonishing deflation of the effect size, and wonder how it ever got that bad. Because it's all very well to say that something is significant, but especially anyone who's in exercise and sports science, kinesiology, you're very familiar with the idea, no doubt, of the fact that something can be wonderfully significant and having absolutely no practical use whatsoever. I mean, if we take a group of trained athletes and they're all doing a back squat and they have some pretty healthy 1RM, 140 kilos, 180, I don't know. My numbers for that are off. I've always been a gentleman of size. Let's say it's 140 kilos. If everyone goes up to 142, then the within subject's result of that will be wildly significant. But 2 kilos on your squat is not much. The effect size will be very small. The significance will be very high, especially in this area that we're talking about right now is characterized by strong within subject results defined over time. And sometimes that makes the effect size calculation tricky. But what it amounts to is that if there's a small consistent change, you get to claim that something is significant while having a really very small actual practical effect on someone. I'm sure you're all aware of how people who are sort of in the trenches of exercise and sports science regard research a lot of the time as inferior to practical knowledge. Now, of course, they take that too far because they're representing their own interests. But there is a point. There is a point there in terms that is very, very dangerous to conflate real world effects and significant effects. And the easiest way to see that through the lens of is this paper any good is what is the effect size? And suffice to say, these aren't very good at all. Now, a quick, I have to put this paper in because it is what I call the scariest goddamn paper I've ever read. Tsuyoshi Miyakawa, I think still is the editor-in-chief of the journal Molecular Brain. And when he got over a period, I think of about 18 months, every time he got a paper that was too good to be true, he immediately wrote back to the authors and said, send data. Half of them withdrew the paper. And then, as I was saying before, until it's published with bad peer review elsewhere, 2/3 of those ended up being published in another journal. Oh, no, I'm sorry, that's wrong. Less than that, because some of them were rejected. Ignore that figure. it's late. Suffice to say, I am at least certain I can do half in my head right now. Withdrawn without providing raw data was half of the beautiful papers, and then half of them were submitted with some raw data, which was deemed insufficient in 95% of the cases. That is a tremendous hit rate for problematic appearing papers actually being problematic, because both of those outcomes are incredibly suspicious. And 41 out of 181 is about 22%. 22% is a very, very bad rate to be thinking about papers where people would prefer that you did not inspect, or in some cases, if you read the paper, implied that the data never existed in the first place. It really is a very, very scary paper, and I thoroughly recommend that everyone read it. It's also very unusual because an editor was doing research on pre-publication metrics. We can't, you and me, we cannot do a paper like this, which is a tremendous shame because I'd absolutely love to. What a perspective. And also, what a terrifying implication. Anyway, it's almost passé now to talk about overpublication. People have been complaining about overpublication forever, as you will shortly see. I don't think this is a macro problem. I think this is an individual problem. The difference between 1 million papers and 100 million papers is how good your digital curation tools are. Search is pretty great. Search is reasonably ubiquitous now. It should be very, very easy for you to query an enormous volume of papers and find the things you want. And if you can't, either you're using the wrong search terms or the search needs to be improved to the point where it very literally can be providing the information that we want. But for individuals, the problem is very obvious. Less time per paper, more incentives to play with any given data set so you get that paper out of the data that you've generated. And of course, more ways to append your name to places where it may not necessarily belong if you were being strictly honest. There is a lot of antisocial behavior that is in laboratory culture. Probably not something I'm going to go into right now, but suffice to say, paper theft, the inappropriate addition of various authors, and a wide variety of related malfeasance is very much alive, and in many respects very much not considered to be misconduct in the way that actually fiddling the data would be. We still have no clear idea of what actually authorship consists of in a scientific publication. It still remains to be properly defined. And honestly, we just make it up as we go along. There have been attempts, of course, but they have a tendency to be field specific because it's very different in high energy physics with 800 authors than it is in philosophy with 2. Suffice to say, I told you it was old, it's old. This is Hannah Arendt in 1953, and I just love this quote. This is from a book of her correspondence with Karl Jaspers. The obligation to publish weighs on everyone here like a nightmare. The academic journals are full of nonsense that not even the author believes, but that is necessary for his career. Yeah, she had a way with words when it came to irritating fascists, and likewise with the pointless rituals of academia. If this is what we generate, then the process is obviously inefficient because it is not a straightforwardly linear kind of game. One very good paper has a tremendous intellectual longevity that 3 not particularly good papers tend to have, especially if it's on a topic that's important. I mean, if you want a good experience of just how much problematic garbage can result when you rush, please go back and read the papers that were coming out on COVID between about March and September of 2020 and find out just how poorly all of that is aged. everyone rushed to be part of the attention. The world was paying attention to what science was doing for once. I remember seeing epidemiological studies on the news, and I thought, well, that they should have always been on the news. It's a real shame that they aren't. But that was a moment where everyone turned to the academy and said, help us figure out what's going on. And a tremendous amount of people thought not, I should be quiet because I don't know, or I should take my time to figure it out. But the sooner I put an answer in front of people, the sooner someone will pay attention to me, which frankly is pathetic. And all of those people should be ashamed of themselves in perpetuity. But my judgment aside, let's talk about outcome switching. I prefer this as a discussion to p-hacking, pre-registration, and selective reporting, all of which I hope this audience will be familiar with to some capacity. The reason I like to talk about outcome switching is because outcome switching is, I probably should say, when you have a pre-registered clinical trial, as you are forced to publish in the vast majority of good medical journals, changing what the primary and secondary outcomes are from the pre-reporting of what is happening in the trial to the actual reporting of what's happening in the trial. It's easier to do research on because it's very well established in a way that pre-registration is not. And it's very easy to make a determination of because you have a strong record of what is supposed to be according to the consort guidelines, which are the 2010 guidelines on exactly how this clinical trial pre-reporting should be done. You have a very strong statement of exactly how it should work in the first place. So it's the most mature version of something that is akin to the pre-registration process. So I think it's the best window into these things. So I've used the medical terminology here. Suffice to say, it's all a bit crap. This is a wonderfound paper by Ben Goldacre's group, led by a guy called Henry Drysdale, who put a tremendous amount of work into this. I found 58 trials out of 67 had discrepancies breaching the consort guidelines with regards to what they reported as their main effect, or whether or not they quietly promoted their secondary effect to their primary effect, or whether or not they just made up new outcomes that were supposed to be interesting by themselves. Now, you can, I should add, you can do all of these things. Plans change over time. Pre-registration goes wrong. Some things only become clear over time, but you have to say so. You have to report it in the manner of which it was recorded. You do not have any obligation, and you certainly should not re-narrativize everything that is happening. That is the p-hacking flavor of outcome switching. Suffice to say, they found all of these discrepancies, wrote to a series of very fancy medical journals, and in general were summarily rejected and regarded as irritating gadflies. So the response from the journals was not, that's actually a very good point. These trials are not following the consort guidelines. They should be edited or changed. It was more, for the love of Christ, please go away. So that's fun. You can read all about it on comparetrials.org, which is a fun little website if you're into being this particular flavor of depressed. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. This is an analysis that me and Dave Grimes did on the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which is the premier, the #1 impact factor journal in your field. Some of you have probably published in it. Well, I think it is my speculative opinion that the reason that they are the #1 journal is because they hit on a very obvious, actually, there's plenty of research on this. There's plenty of the actual scientometric research on journals manipulating their own internal metrics. And one of the easiest ways to do it is by publishing a variety of research items that are not actually research. So the way the impact factor is calculated is what allows this to happen. An impact factor is citations divided by research items. And a research item is only a research paper. And it has to have data, it has to have statistics, it has to have reporting. It needs to contain some empirical center. So a book review is not a research article. An editorial is not a research article. Or in the case of an issue from 2017, 8 separate editorials are not research articles. What they are, however, is items within the journal that can be cited and make the impact factor go up. So any journal publishing an editorial, it can only make the impact factor go up because it does not affect the denominator of the impact factor. So I don't think you need to look particularly carefully at that graph to see the fact that in the 70s and 80s, the proportion of journal content that was original research was about 1. And this went to a low point in 2017 of 0.27. In other words, and I should say at this point, I'm splitting out at this point in time what are called HCIs, what we call highly cited items. And those are research papers that are either review articles or meta-analysis. So those are favored for a variety of reasons, which are not manipulating journal metrics, although they could be done for that as well. We simply can't tell. But if you have an issue where you have 8 editorials and 3 research articles, I think it's obviously is suggesting at the very least that your content policy has changed. And if you do something like that, and especially if you make a beeline for and encourage outlandish opinions, conflict, editorials that directly address other editorials, you're going to get a tremendous amount of interest and citations. And all of those citations calculated on your impact factor are free. That's how you make a really good quality journal, by publishing as little actual research as possible. And if that sounds completely backwards, it is. Welcome to the party. Last one. Fraud and falsification. Now, I don't want to cover my work on error detection as related to this, because error detection is not really about fraud or falsification. It's about the process of finding mistakes. And it is entirely focused on that. I don't really care about fraud. I'm not a fraud finder or a fraud buster. The point I'd like to make here is a little bit adjacent to that, and it's the fact that I think the estimates that we have of how many researchers are dishonest, in the sense that they are doing, let's say, robustly dishonest research processes are taking place. Some of this is determined by survey. So you write to a person who says, I'm going to be honest to you about all those times I've lied before. I think that's psychologically naive. Likewise, what you ask people, have you ever done this once? I mean, well, they could have done it once, but they could have done it 100 goddamn times. But not only would no one have the memory to be able to report that, and they're very unlikely to, but it's likely that a wide variety of different people within the kind of, we don't have a sort of a developed sociology of fraud because it's incredibly difficult to investigate and people don't want you to find out. So all of those people who've done something naughty at least once, what's behind the curtain of at least once? Is it one time or is it 100? We really have no idea. I think a much better estimate is this estimate on the left here, which is from Elizabeth Bick's towering achievement of a paper where she manually screened 20,000 biology papers, give or take, and found that at least half of them had features that were suggestive of deliberate manipulation. So that's an actual figure, and that's not 2% of researchers say they've done it at least once, which is what's happening on the right-hand side, which I think is a waste of time, frankly. That's 2% of papers. It's not 2% of papers as a hard number. That's the absolute minimum of detectable problems by one person who had to do 20,000 of them. In other words, it's probably higher. How high is it? We don't know, and it's very difficult to find out. But suffice to say, this is a very uncomfortable topic for a lot of people, but it's very easily extrapolated from a figure that's like that. When we were doing the original Grimm paper, Nick Brown and myself, mainly him, but I was there too. We screened a big stack of papers in the social sciences, and about 1 in 6 of the problems that we found were really serious. Really serious. The papers that were amenable to being checked by the method that we'd come up with. Half of them had a discrepancy, and 1 in 6 had a really serious discrepancy that pointed to the fact that something was properly wrong. So that being the case, my estimate is that probably half of them were indicative of not an unreported variable or something else, but the error was from some tremendous inherent naughtiness that had gone into the process. If I remember the figures correctly, that would make it 5 out of 51 individual papers failing our test and revealing themselves to be incredibly suspicious in post-publication review, which is 10%. Now, there'd be a huge confidence interval on that because we're only talking about 5 out of 50, but it's not a very satisfying number, is it? It's difficult to hear. It's almost difficult for me to say, but here we are. So, good estimate, bad estimate. And now Ellen's pissed off. So, it's difficult to hear about all of this. It's difficult to consider all of it on aggregate. And it's especially difficult to see the kind of indecision and lack of action that happens in and around it. So if Ellen comes to terms with all of this, what's eventually going to happen to her? Well, as the sharp-minded of you will have noticed, Ellen R. Bry is an anagram of Hellbringer. I had to get a heavy metal reference in here somewhere. So what's Ellen going to do? Unleash hell. She's angry. She's angry. And frankly, she has every right to be angry. Most people start to do graduate work in science and they start to think about it in a professional context with a certain ideal of it in mind. And it's very rarely an ideal that's congruent with literally everything I just said. There is a loss of faith involved. There's a feeling that you've been taken for a ride. So what are we going to do with that? Are we going to burn everything to the ground? Are we going to be bombastic? No, you can. I mean, it's possible. But honestly, it's a framing that I don't think is particularly productive. And yeah, that's me saying it. I realize that some of you are well aware that I have a history of being highly bombastic and irritating in a variety of circumstances. But I don't think it's the way if we think about this as a collective problem. I really don't. And I think this article is really interesting because it played up a lot of the conflict that was happening at the time in the social sciences around the replication movement or replication efforts. But everyone slept on this quote, which I think is one of the best quotes I've ever given to a journalist. I really like this one. You're not going to click your fingers and get your revolution. It's going to be weird and slow, and when it's done, people aren't going to fully appreciate the fact that it happened. And frankly, if you want to reform the area that you all work in, that is how it plays out. That is how it plays out over a period of years, over a time scale that you may not personally be comfortable with. And that's why this says calm down. It's not a sprint, it's an ultra marathon. That's Badwater on the left-hand side, which is an ultra marathon through Death Valley. That's the reform movement, not the 100-meter sprint. You need to adjust your time horizon when you're thinking about how a reform effort is going to work. Everyone wants to do everything, usually by themselves, usually immediately, and do a whole lot of damage to a system that has, to some extent, alienated and annoyed them, in some cases, actively held them back for trying to do the right thing. and is extremely resistant to the mathematical certainties that are provided by various improvements of the processes that we collectively accept. But you can't consensus build around these quick ideas. You can't consensus build around the sort of flash in the pan ideas. And basically, if it's not the middle of the night, in general, anyone who sounds like me wins battles and not wars. Now, I'm not saying learn from my mistakes. I mean, in general, I have a reason for any rabble rousing that I've done. But more the fact is, bear in mind that anything that is in this realm has to be, by virtue, by definition, a community project. It's not about you. It's always going to be about us. And any reform effort that you choose really has to keep that in mind. And that applies equally to this society as to everything that you're about to hear. Also to every other effort that's been taken to make improvements in this area. Change your time horizon. Calm down. I promise you, it's going to be harder than you think. Next part. I had a different F word for forget, but I was convinced to take it out. Should is the most dangerous word in scientific reform. And every time I hear it, I start reaching for the nearest heavy object, maybe some kind of attractive cat ornament or a half brick, so I can throw it at the person who said it. When people talk about what should change within science and they say should, and it's followed up with inaction, it becomes an excuse to put the world to rights, imagine a different future, and then do absolutely nothing about it. So I'll give you an example. My funny little project, the 450 movement, is proposing that people get paid for doing peer review. I came up with a contract. I got some lawyers to help me write a contract. You can send the contract to the journal, guarantees parameters of good review, and retains their right not to pay you if it's terrible. Likewise, you accept the fact that you have to do it within a time frame, et cetera, legally should be pretty watertight. It took a while. And then, I come up with creative reasons for people to use that because I think reviewers should be paid. And that honestly is a very, very minimal thing that I've done. I mean, I can't go out and stiff arm the global publishing enterprise and to be able to pay us all. And the best response to this I ever got was like, oh, this is a terrible, fatuous idea. What we should do is reform the entire global publication movement and start again from scratch. That should in this space. It's dumb, it's empty, it's vainglorious, and it gives you an excuse to do nothing because you get to say, well, the entire thing is entirely corrupt from its outset. We need to do something that's infinitely more grand than your silly little attempt to do whatever. Everyone listen to me. I also have no intention of the multiple decades of international consensus building that will be required to do something like that. I have just chosen to define a variety of multinational businesses out of existence. Avoid people who say this shit, please. It is cancerous to think like this. And anyone who's got a new initiative every month, every 3 months, there's some new thing that they're trying. Please realize that none of them are going to get anywhere.
On Friday.
Should is an excuse not to do anything. I don't want to get off on a rant here, but I promise you this is true. I've heard this so much, and it's never resulted in a damn thing. Related to both of these, pick your shots. You don't have time to do everything. You don't have time to get keen about everything. You can run as many seminars and give as many talks as you like. But when it comes to actually doing the work over a period of years to change something, think very hard about where you choose to dig because you only get to swing the shovel so many times, right? Longevity, accessibility, inclusivity. Those are my criteria. Longevity in the sense that if you're going to start it, will it be maintained in 2 years? Will it be maintained in 5 years? Are you going to write a piece of software? Are you going to maintain a web page, provide a resource? Will it continue once you've lost interest in it? The answer, the vast majority of the time, is no. So think about how it's going to continue to live. Accessibility, can everyone get into it? I mean, that one should be reasonably self-evident, but inclusivity is actually the big one. And not only do I mean everyone's invited, but I mean, and this is difficult to say, the people who may resent or actively dislike what you're doing need to have a space preserved for them as well. And unfortunately for you, sometimes those are the people who are in control. You can't just define an editor-in-chief out of existence like they're a lemma in a philosophical argument. They're not just going to go away. So what this means is it's very difficult to find the right place to dig sometimes. Really hard. Really hard. And think very carefully and take a lot of consensus opinions before you make your decision. That's not to say listen to everyone. If they tell you it's a bad idea, don't do it. If that way, nothing would get done. What I'm saying is, if you have the future in mind, think very carefully about how you're going to fulfill criteria like this going forward. Last point, I promise. This one's very easy to explain. Get the money. I don't like the fact that this is here either, but paying people is a good thing. There is only so much that can be volunteered, I promise you. And when it comes to especially the maintenance of complicated software, or say an office in any capacity where people need to be responded to all the time, any sort of community support, it's very, very hard to do that for nothing. Everyone loves the Center for Open Science, and it's dope, which is in Charlottesville, Virginia. The reason the Center for Open Science got started is that a foundation gave them about $5 million. And a few years later, I think gave them another $10 million. That's, no one wants to talk about that, but and there's plenty of volunteer effort, plenty of researchers involved with it. But the actual thing itself was started on a solid base of scientific necessity and $15 million. That's just what it costs. That's just what software engineers cost. That's just what the maintenance of something like that costs. That's what it means. So as you're going to develop projects, as you're going to think about reform in this area, as much as I hate to recommend the fact that you need to play this grubby game, you have to think about where the money's going to come from, because some things will not be maintained by a herd of even the most well-meaning and effort-giving volunteers. Get money. Not from anyone. Don't roll anyone in the street or anything like that. But think very, very hard about who's going to get paid when something like this needs to happen. It is the way of the world. I've put them all here in a really big font because I really want you to pay attention to these ones. And you can change forget to the real word in your head if you so desire. That's it. That's all I've got. Thank you very much for listening to me. It's a real shame that I can't actually be there in person, and that we can't be doing this under different circumstances. It's also a shame that it's now 3:15 in the morning and that I'm recording a talk that I should be given live, but shit happens in the big city. It's real nice speaking to you. I wish you all the very best for the rest of this conference.
Fantastic. James, thank you so much. When we initially had the idea for this conference, I remember the very first thing that jumped into my head is like, wonder is there any way we could get James Heathers to come? And I think what a way to kick things off. Guys, throughout that, it occurred to me in the first few moments that if I am scrolling through the chat, I'm probably interrupting everyone's view because I was sharing screens. So I don't really know what went on in the chat, but it seems to be busy. I hope there was good conversations. James, I'm not sure if you're still here, but just want to say thank you so much on behalf of everyone. well, can't speak for everyone, but I can speak for me. I love that. And I think that was a really, really great way to start off. Equal parts depressing and motivating.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Emma. Can everyone hear me? Give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay, rock and roll. As might be expected, if I record a talk, and that was my third go doing it at 3:30 in the morning, I tend to be a little bit lower energy than I normally would be. I was looking forward to coming and seeing everyone in person and really kicking the studs off it. But it's not to be. I won't bore you with everything that's happened in the last hour. Really, really happy to be doing that. For all the hassle that it caused me, and wow, did it? I'm really glad you had that. I've been working on and in and around all of those ideas for a very long time. If it's, I'm not going to do links to social or anything like that. You can Google me if you need to find me. I'm happy to talk to anyone. That's all I got, unless there's questions.
I think, well, I hope that there managed to be some questions in the chat, but I think we'll go on, because we are now going to go from all the problems in science and everything that is wrong on to people who are actively solving things. We're going to move on to abstracts, and we've got some great ones coming up. Once again, James, thank you so much. Hope you have a good trip. Safe flight.
Keep it positive. Nice to meet you all.
Cheers.